Welcome, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about the idea of social global stratification. So, essentially, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit more intimidating than it needs to sound. So, for all of you who have taken environmental sciences or are taking one right now with earth sciences, one of the easiest ways to think about stratification is to think about it from this perspective. Now, let me kind of build on that. So, when we think about fault lines and earthquakes, we understand that the strata or the layers of earth are not evenly placed, right? And so when you're on a fault line, you have disadvantages that can create earthquakes. Places like California, who are more located centrally on fault lines, tend to have more earthquakes than places like Illinois that do not have this. This can be taken as an understanding towards the total and utter breakdown of the stratification system that is within the world as we know it, as well as the local and the communal dynamics that we experience every single day. So when you're thinking about the term stratification, you can think about it from this biological or earth science construct, right? Because there are not equal distributions of land. Some are located on fault lines and some are not. So when we're talking about stratification as a social construction, we're looking at the same thing, that people are not born into equal, all the same level groundings. Many people are born into various types of socioeconomic statuses. Those who are born on a higher status may not suffer from those as much as those who are born on a lower socioeconomic status, and then thus the opportunities or the earthquakes will not be evenly felt within the social dynamics. So I'm going to be sharing my screen right now, and we're going to be talking about the global and the social stratification that surrounds us on a day-to-day basis. So when thinking about this, pardon my screen here, realize that we are going to be talking about stratification, and this is part one. There are three parts to this, so bear with me, and just hold on as we go through this larger process. So first things first, stratification is a system of social standings. In essence, what you're looking at is how we understand the world around us, right? As sociologists, we study groups, society, and not the individual. Thus, stratification, we look at the status and position, not the individual person. So we're looking at the whole picture, not the small pictures. As I mentioned before, layers of earth and layers within society, not all equally level and are unevenly distributed. Thus, it works the same way when we think about this in the social stratification. We categorize this as we talked about when we talked about categorizational systems, such as when we mention aggregates versus groups of people, right? Of society. And these are based on what are called socioeconomic tiers, or as we talk about it constantly, and you'll hear me use this word all the time in this class, socioeconomic status, SES. How we do this is through wealth, income, race, education, and power and prestige. Prestige and power are not always the same, right? If you have different levels of prestige, Weber talked about this a lot when he discussed how we develop and understand prestige as a general concept. So let's say lawyer and doctor, those have power and prestige, right? But power and prestige many times do not always equally divide into monetary dynamics, right? There are jobs out there that have a much higher prestige with a lower pay. There are jobs that have higher power but have less prestige because of social understanding. Look at people who have extreme power right now in the Supreme Court. Their prestige has been questioned as we are dealing with a lot of these social inequities, such as Roe v. Wade being overturned. They're not likely to have as much respect or prestige, but they still have the power. So it's not always the same to dividend or lines, right? So what is stratification? Well, like I mentioned, it is the division of the unequal treatment or unequal distribution of power and prestige governed through wealth, income, race, education, etc. Again, tie back to when I said, think about it like layers of earth. That does make it a little easier. So as we're looking at this, let's go to the next thing here. So what is, as we keep talking about this, social stratification? So as we have the various levels of society like the earth, we would then look at the idea of the cultural norms that are in place every single day within society. American culture values the power of the almighty dollar, and some cultures may value wisdom, right? Or family connection. So it's not really a cultural particular per se, it's more of a cultural particular, my apologies, than it is a cultural universal. Not everyone has the same principles of what is social power, what is social prestige. So a cultural universal, however, it does vary. So cultural particulars, universals, as we talked about, things that you can expect to understand everywhere versus some things that are different some places. Different cultures, as I just mentioned, have different values, different measurements of wealth and success. As sociologists, as I mentioned, we study the groups. So we're trying to understand about the systems of inequality or systems of equality or values, and wealth that impact different groups as a whole. Your family matters, it really does, as the slide says. This is what we talk about with inherited wealth, and generational poverty, right? We've talked about the social inequalities in the unequitable system that has been going on. It's been a big conversation within inside the US right now. Distributions of wealth are not equal. Think about the various ways of people who are not able to inherit wealth based on inequalities of the system. Think about those who were historically the slaves of this country, right? We have those people of color who have backgrounds where their family were brought here and they weren't given opportunities. Racial lines have divided this, and people have not been able to pass down wealth through property, such as homes, when there were such things as having to establish the Fair Housing Act, because people were not shown these types of ways of gaining property and wealth. So we see this differentiation, this unequal dividing of money and property and value and prestige that have perpetually caused problems within the society that we're within, creating these unequal systems and making people of certain groups have a higher economic value and social value than those below them, just based on inherited problems, right? So family, old money, new money, status, power, and prestige. The average family versus the Rothschilds or the Gettys, right? Like, we are not going to be able to compete with the Hiltons. But then the Hiltons are in a different socioeconomic and reference group than ourselves, right? So you see the situation of the differentiations and the divisions of social collateral, social currency. So when we talk about stratification, we have to understand that there are different systems at play. Historically, there have been different systems as well. When looking at how can one move across the social classes allows for understanding if it's a closed or an open system. If you are unable to change your social status by achievement, then you're not in an open system. If you're able to change your system, your social status by a solution, by working hard, then that would put you in an open system. Now, I know that sounds a little confusing. I feel like I jumbled my words a bit, but if you don't have a way to get out, you're in a closed. If you have a way to get out, you're in an open. So if my father was a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer, I will be a farmer. This would be a closed system. If my father grew up in a family of farmers, but he went to college and ended up starting a business, now he's a millionaire, ideal scenario, right? This would be an open system. An example of a closed system, historically, contextually, would be the idea of a caste system that was not only is most understood in cultures that is easier to represent, and that's not the case in general in this, but India is a good example of a caste system, where you would have a system in place where it's a closed system. You have ascribed statuses, we talked about this, things that are put upon you and they remain with you, and their assigned occupations, skills, or interests, they don't matter. You're in the position that you're within. It's a caste system, it's a closed system. And then we have endogamous marriage, where you can't marry into the next social class. You can only marry within your social class. Thus, you are not able to use marriage as a tool as it has historically been. So caste systems promoted the idea of moral duty to accept your social standings, usage of culture values to reinforce the system. These types of social systems promoted belief in fate, destiny, and the will of a higher power rather than promoting the individual freedoms as a value. Through the process of socialization, people were taught to accept his or her or they or them's position and not question it. And as I mentioned, endogamous marriage does not allow you to maintain ability to moving up through marriages, right? So you do not have what is called exogamous marriage, we'll talk about, where you could marry into a different category. So open system, unlike in open systems, endogamous marriages were used only to be between people of the same social category. If you were poor, you had to marry someone who was poor. You couldn't marry someone who was of a different set of stars, right? You couldn't change your stars. The class system, this is the idea, open up to the idea of an open system. The class systems are built on both social factors and individual achievement. Unlike caste systems, these are built on the idea of open systems. You do not have the class consistency. You do not stay in the same social status you are born into, because it isn't just fate or luck of the draw. You are free to make your own destiny if possible, right? That doesn't mean you can, but it means it's open, right? So open based on social factors, individual achievement. Class consists of groups of people who share similar connected to wealth, income, and education, as well as occupation. And like I mentioned here, we have exogamous marriage, the idea of unions of spouses from different social categories, intergenerational mobility through marriage. Now I want to mention that. I always talk about this in class. We all have been raised to love, right? Marry for love. That wasn't really a case. For a long time, marriage was a tool. You would marry off your daughter into a wealthy family so that you would have intergenerational mobility, intergenerational wealth. Think about the play Hamilton. The oldest Schuyler sister mentions that she knows her job, and her job was to marry rich, because that was the way that you would change the category of your family. Marriage was a tool, not for love. And many times, if you didn't know this, the actual bride's husband would have to pay the groom's husband a dowry in case the wedding didn't go well, because the system wasn't based upon this stratification of love. It was based upon this idea of how you get out of your current socioeconomic status. So exogamous marriage opened up a new tool. You didn't have to stay within your category because you could marry out of it. So additionally, you have the dynamics of being able to marry into different statuses. This is what I just mentioned with an exogamous marriage. Many times marriage in the past, as I was talking about, was a union or an agreement. It wasn't for love. Family social statuses were very much interconnected with how we did this. So when we're looking at this kind of construction, we have these two systems, open and closed. Closed systems, many times tied to caste systems. There are other types of closed systems, but it's easiest to kind of reference old school versions of India that had a much more defined caste system. Now, that isn't the case much anymore. There are still rural parts of India that have caste systems, but most of those have gone away. North Korea would be a good example of an actual existing caste system or a closed system, right? That people do not have any choice of changing their outcomes. But in sociology, Max Weber and many of the theorists talk about what could be seen as the ideal society. There's never been one to say. There's been remnants of it. There's been existences of an idea of it, but this would be a meritocracy. The ideal system based on personal effort and merit to obtain social standings, that you truly could control your outcomes. It's a real, kind of the ideal versus real conversation. It's not something we've seen. There's not been a situation where we had this idea, this construction of a meritocracy, but we've seen little bits and pieces of it. And there's more meritocracy in open systems than there was in class systems than there was within closed systems. Ooh, that's a lot of information there. So let's get to the next portion here, which is cultural attitudes and perpetuate careers. Attitudes and beliefs. Remember, they're different things, right? I believe something versus the attitude that we have there. Increase the social gap of inequity, right? If we pay social workers a better wage, do we take the care out of care work? It's a very long conversation to have. The idea of how we view a job can determine if that job is viewed and paid well. This is tied to a thesis called the Davis-Moore thesis. And this thesis states that the greater the social function importance, the greater the social reward should be. However, if that is the real argument, and I ask this to you, class, I ask this to you, if that's the real argument, the greater the social reward is based on the social function, then how do we justify how educators are paid so terribly, but someone who is on a sports team might be paid more, right? The Davis-Moore thesis has been consistently challenged by even functionalists who created it because it doesn't really make as much sense. Now, the socioeconomic status is interesting, right? You have the typical things where you have doctors and lawyers are seen as very prestigious on top and they make a lot of money. However, if you look at the SES or how we've done it, you can Google socioeconomic status and it'll show you different dynamics. Think about why are college professors who are educators viewed with more prestige than someone who's in high school, teaching high school? They're both doing education, right? Sales is a meritocracy industry that you make as little or as much as you can based on your own work. It does not do anything for the larger part of society except move product from give and take, right? But it doesn't have much of a social basis. People see them as dirty car salesmen, right? But we're also paid a lot of money to sell these things. So as someone who came from a marketing and sales career, you didn't gain a lot of prestige in the sense of being a salesperson, but you gain a lot of money. So the money could equal power. And so if we look at the idea of a stockbroker as the desired job, then we have the cultural attitudes towards this career that we want that money, and then the reward might be higher. Thus, the cultural attitudes perpetuates careers, not just the function of the roles, as talked about by the Davis-Moore thesis. And this is one of the reasons that Tuman, which we'll get into, challenged this idea of the Davis-Moore thesis, because if we have this perpetuation of an idea of wealth equal with power and status, then how do we justify the idea that people who are doing good for the world, such as educators, are given a low wage? And the Wall Street brokers who are viewed as snakes make a high wage and have that power, right? Why does a Wolf of Wall Street respected versus Dead Poet Society is not having it? We want to believe in the good, but does it really equal the cultural attitudes that perpetuate careers? It's a good question to bring up on Yellow Dig. It really is. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But when we look at society's occupational structure, we can also see that when societies are taken by large-scale social change, the social perspectives can be called into question. This is the case when we look at the Great Depression, right? The silent generation was taught to save money, and that the process of living outside our means was wrong. We may be going into this right now with this recession that's happening, that we're seeing a lot of gas prices and a lot of things become more expensive. The goal to save money has become more towards what the Great Depression was having, and we're seeing this replicated because we're going through an economic downturn. But then baby boomers inherited some of those traits, but also had different socializing because they went through a very economically boosting time. Gen X, so they ended up spending a lot of money as well. Gen X was socialized to work hard and keep your nose down and you'll be justly rewarded. This ended up not benefiting them with the socialization because Gen Y, also known as millennials, ended up being taught take what you want and get what you want. Go in and ask for that promotion. And many times millennials were ended up being bosses over Gen Xers because of how they were socialized. We also have this construction of the living wage gets pulled into almost every political conversation, and this disconnection between generations is also brought up well. Baby boomers are constantly attacked that their ideas of college and earnings paid very much different than how socially recognized it became. If you didn't know, Gen X was told to take the most on their student loans because you don't know if you're going to get it again. And then Sally Mae changed it so you couldn't default on loans. So this socialization ended up not benefiting them. And we get this whole construction of the debate of what is the living wage, like I was saying, the Great Resignation. How does that change our social perspectives? Do we save? Do we spend? How do we identify wealth? What is wealth? How do we have material versus non-material culture? What is the idea of good and expensive things versus things that are too expensive? Great Depression, Great Recession, housing crash. We're seeing this from work from home movement on the idea of a culture, having an environment and being essential. There's just many ways to look at this. Now, I also want to point out, and this is important here, that wealth and income are not the same. Right? So you have what you're paid and then you have what you've accumulated. So the social stratification within the US is not as evenly distributed. There's a social stratification within our society. We are an open system, sure, but in sociology, we tend to break the socioeconomic tiers into 5 different quintiles, that being the bottom, second, third, fourth, and top quintile. The bottom quintile is, as of 2015, making about $22,800 over OTE, or overall total earnings, not just salary, what they're bringing home. And the middle, as of 2015, is about $56,000 OTE, overall total earnings, and that's the median, so in the middle, right? Within the top, making over $117,000. The top quintile earns about 50% of all the income in the United States, with about 20% being earned by the top 5% alone. The bottom, these households earn only 3.4% of the total wealth within the United States. The average net worth is about negative 6,000, negative 6,000 when all bills are paid and all things are talking for the bottom quintile. And the median wealth is about 68,000. Look at that change right there, negative money to 68,000. So what do you think the top is? What do you think the top is? Right? There's the 22,800. There's the 56. What do you think the top is? Well, the top is over 117,000. So the average net worth is about negative 6,000 for the bottom. And then the average net worth for the top is 9 times the median. That comes out to $630,000 overall total income in 2015. Just let that sit for a second. Have to think about that. People are earning negative median money at the bottom and earning insane money at the top. And this is when we talk about the broken dynamics of our social inequalities and equities towards income distribution within this country. So wealth and income, I said this, wealth equals net assets, savings, investments, and house. These are all the things you have. It's why you've seen these systematic inequalities happen, because of how people are able to contribute wealth when it hasn't been delineated or distributed properly. Income are your wages, earns. Parents' social standings, base of economic structure, which we talked about with Marx, that's how society is built. Wealth divided through generations, educational attainment, this became a big deal, right? You know, the idea of college degrees been pulled into question over the years, right? Assumed prestige based on education and tied to potential earnings, right? Plumbers get a lot of disrespect, but yet they make multiple 6 figures in some situations, right? So you can say that they're very well, but because of the social prestige or the dirty job behind them, they aren't given as much prestige as if you were a doctor, right? So assumed prestige based upon occupational connection or occupational prestige. And your status upon birth, ascribed status, that what you're just given, is that what your parents' social class was. Your family's wealth and income levels dictate very much how much opportunity you will have as you are socialized and start your own journey. Generational wealth, new money, old money, how you're socialized matters. You can come up rich, as like 50 Cent talks about. I have all the things that rich people want, but they still don't like me. Because you have socialization dynamics that you learn the little intricacies of the nonverbal ways to communicate that you've grown up wealthy. And again, we have wealth levels tend to be variably by demographic groupings. Women tend to have lower individual income levels than men. So when it comes to wealth and demographics, it's very much tied to the ability to gain these types of opportunities. As I just said, women tend to have lower wealth than their counterparts of men. And we know this because there's been social inequality towards women, and married couples tend to accumulate more wealth than non-married couples statistically, right? So what you're seeing is race is very linked to that wealth obtainment and has an unfortunate past of discrimination. This is very much tied to the way that median levels of income of wealth in a white household compared to that of a black household is about 12 times the average. That's crazy when you think about it. This is very much connected to ownership of property. Once again, pull into the difference between income and wealth, right? Patrick Sharkey, an American sociologist, studied the neighborhoods and wealth that was found within Black families making $100,000 a year would live in neighborhoods that white families only making $30,000 a year would live in. This is very much connected to the redlining and blockbusting, which we'll go down and talk about, but also how people will stay in communities when they feel connected, which ties to the construction of symbolic interactionalism, that they want to be connected to the people around them. So home ownership ties to the ability towards economic growth. Patrick Sharkey's study really showed that a lot of people, especially African Americans, will stay in neighborhoods they feel connected to, even if it doesn't provide generational mobility, right? If you don't move when you start making a lot of money, your house will sell at the price you bought it at, which does not generate continual wealth. One thing to mention here, if you are not familiar with this, please do some research. Redlining, this was legal. It was a discriminatory practice. You can think of it like gerrymandering, right? The idea of creating different districts. They would have examples here, and I'll have a little TikTok that you can watch. I may or may not play it for this video just for time reasons, but essentially ways that areas were viewed as red, green, or yellow. If they were red, they would not receive benefits through the city. And it was actually legal to do this redlining practice, discriminatory practice, and until from the 30s until 1968, when they made the Fair Housing Act. Very much legal and used to distribute and unequally measure wealth and allow for racial dynamics to impact most of the people here. These types of behaviors, even though illegal, are still happening today, though. It's been very much on the news that many real estate agents would not take people of color to certain neighborhoods. It's also very true that people of color tend to be more commonly in neighborhoods that have more similar social stratification, as Patrick Sharkey talked about. The practice of not allowing certain groups to own or purchase property has had massive damage to the long-term wealth of groups of people. Homes are very strong assets towards the long-term wealth. And the practice of not allowing people to move out or of area was blocked. And the idea of saying that it was illegal, but still people are doing it when they created the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So again, watch this video.
Since urban planning.
Another example, kind of a funnier one, if you want to say funny, but looking at the idea of POCs being discriminated against with redlining even to this day. And then we can talk about blockbusting. Essentially put down here, sadly throughout history, there's been employments of majority groups using methods to maintain their superiority. And many times this has been done through groups of not having obvious objectives and having a racist outcome towards it. One of these is the idea of blockbusting, in which African-American families were bought into historically good markets with all white neighborhoods, right? But when introducing these people of color into these neighborhoods, they would then have what would happen is also known as white flight, that all the people would suddenly start leaving because they felt their equity would lower. So then companies would come in and tell them that the area, as the white flight was happening, was going to lose its value, and then they would lose its value and then buy that house that they had spent generations trying to save up for and massively reduce the sale price, thus enforcing, unfortunately, consistency of inequalities of wealth distribution. If we say that 80% of the current housing market, right now, if we say that that whites represent 80% of the current housing market, and if they were all to depart an area, that 80% of the wealth within that neighborhood will have gone, thus making the people who are living there, when you see this idea of white flight, really impact how these individuals are able to gain wealth, because suddenly you're having the systemic racism impact the ability to gain potential long-term wealth, generational wealth. So this is what was called white flight, the sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially or ethno-culturally diverse. Blockbusting was used from this to be able to break the homes up and then have the prejudice-driven market instability, causing property values to decline, impacting general wealth obtainment. So status consistency, how income, occupation, education are or are not consistently across social positional rankings. When society has more flexibility towards changing status, this makes a lower level of status consistency. Social stratification systems determine social position based on factors like income, education, occupation. If society has more flexible systems towards changing your status, then it is a lower level of status consistency. And if society doesn't allow for the changing of your status or social dynamics, then it is a higher level of status consistency. This means that status consistency ends up being likely. You are born in this status, you die in this status, and your children will be in this status. My father was a farmer, I was a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer. According to the sociologist Veblen, the idea of purchasing or wearing certain items as visible signs of your wealth, this is known as conspicuous consumption. If you are buying a Rolex to have an interview, right, and you spend all that money, you feel it will help you in the long run. You can have situations where nice homes, nice trips be able to depict if you are wealthy. And people use this to be able to flex on social media to say the life that they want to live, right? It's a very common thing. Little data for you, family of 3 in the US. Go feel free to look at this if you'd like to. It's Pew Research, so it's verified. We have the US Census in 2019. And then we have the share of adults living in middle income households is unchanged since 2011. Crazy when you think about that. Now, I'm gonna pull up the next slide deck here, so bear with me. But I actually think I'm gonna stop the video right here because it's been a pretty long lecture. Part 2 will be following this. We'll go more detailed into social stratification. I hope you got something from this, and please look over the slides, look over the data that was on the slides. Have any questions, please always email me. Otherwise, I'll see you in part 2.